Magnus took a psalter, and sung while the battle lasted, but did not shield himself. This battle was both hard and long, and both spears were thrown and blows struck. It was long so that it could not be seen between them which way the fight would turn. King Magnus shot with a crossbow, and another man from Helgeland by his side. Hugh the Proud fought most sturdily. He was so clad and burnied that there was no bare spot on him save the eyes. King Magnus bade the men from Helgeland that they should both shoot at him at once, and so they did, and one arrow struck him on his nose guard, but the other went in at the eye, and flew afterwards through the head. That shot was reckoned to the king. 45. There fell Hugh the Proud. After that the British fled and had lost many men. But King Magnus had won a great victory, but had yet lost many good men, and very many were wounded. So this was made about it. Bolts on Bernison came rattling. Might and main the monarch fought. Ager's ruler bent his crossbow. Blood on helmets there was sprinkled. Bowstrings hail on mail came flying. Men fell fast, and Horda's king, land with onslaught hard, dealt his death blow to the earl. Then King Magnus made Anglicia his own as far south as ever the kings of Norway of old owned it. Anglicia is a tithing of Bretland, Wales. Calisa Bear's son had got many wounds in Anglicia Sound, though none of them at once mortal. Afterwards King Magnus turned back by the south course along Scotland. King Magnus had made Magnus Erlend's son his page, and he served always at the king's board. But after the battle in Anglesey Sound King Magnus took a great dislike to him. He said he had behaved like a coward. It fell on a night when King Magnus lay off Scotland that Magnus Erlend's son ran away from King Magnus' ship when he thought he had the best chance of flying from the king. He jumped overboard and swam to land, and made up his berth so that it seemed as if a man lay there. But when he came to land he ran into the woods, and was in his underclothing. He struck his foot, and hurt himself much, as he was barefoot, and so he could walk no longer at that time. He came to a great tree, and climbed up there into the branches, and there bound up his foot, and hid himself there in the branches for some time. But in the morning when men went to meet on board the king's ship, the king asked where Magnus Erlend's son was. He was told that he was asleep in his berth. The king bade them wake him, and said something else than sleep must have come over him when he lay longer than other men. But when they took place, then he was missing. Then the king bade them search for him and let loose the slaughterhounds. But when the hounds were loose, they came at once on his track, and ran off to the wood, and came to that tree in which Magnus was up. Then one hound ran round and round the oaken bay. Magnus had a stick in his hand, and threw it at the hound, and hit him on the side. The hound laid his tail between his legs and ran down to the ships, and the others after it. The king's men could not find Magnus. He lay hid for a while in the wood, and was next heard of in the court of Malcolm the King of Scots, and stayed there a while. But sometimes he was in Bretland with a certain bishop. He was sometimes in England, or in other places with his friends, but he did not come back to the Orkneys while King Magnus lived. King Magnus held on his course from the south along Scotland, and then came to meet him messengers from Malcolm the King of Scots, and offered him peace. They said thus that the King of Scots would give up to him all those isles that lie to the west of Scotland, between which and the mainland he could sail in a ship with a fixed rudder. But when King Magnus ran in from the south to Kintyre, he let them drag a cutter over the neck of Kintyre. He held the tiller, and so took as his own all Kintyre. That is better than the best isle in the southern isles save Man. It goes from the west of Scotland, and has a narrow neck of land at the top of it, so that their ships are very often drawn over. King Magnus held on thence into the southern isles, but sent his men into Scotland's firths. They were to row in hugging the land on one side, and out hugging it on the other, and so King Magnus claimed as his own all the isles to the west of Scotland. Then the king gave it out that he would sit that winter in the southern isles, but gave leave to those men who he thought had most need of it to fare home. But when the levies knew that, they became homesick, and grumbled badly about their being so long away. The king then had a talk with his men and counselors. He went and looked at the wounds of his men. Then the king went to see Calisaber's son and asked after his wounds. Calais said they healed very little, and let him know that he could not tell how they would turn out. The king asked counsel of him. Calais asked, "Is it not so, king, that now your friends steal away from you?" The king made as though he thought that were not so. Calais bade him call them under arms, and so muster his men. The king did so, and then missed many men. And when the king told this to Calais, then Calais chanted this: "How thy wary chiefs reward thee for those precious gifts of thine. West the vessel's sides are shaking. Try our trustiness, O king." Then the king answers, "Ill have I my boons bestowed, boons that brighten face of man. Buoyant keel declined the billow, now must I command in vain." After this the king kept watch and ward if men ran from him, and let none. When King Magnus was in the southern isles, then he got as a bride for his son Sigurd, Jade Munya, daughter of Murkiarton, Thalby's son, the Irish king of Connaught. Sigurd was the 9 winters old and the maiden 5. This winter Calisaber's son breathed his last of his wounds. In Anglesey Sound had fallen Sigurd Skewer, Calais' kingsman. He was leagueman in Ager. Next spring early King Magnus fared away from the southern isles. He fared first to the Orkneys. There he heard from the east across the sea of the death of the earls, and how Erlend had died in Nardaros, and was buried there, and Paul in Bergen. In the spring in the Orkneys King Magnus gave away Gunhilda, the daughter of Earl Erlend, to Cole Calais' son, as an atonement for the loss of his father. And some estates in the Orkneys went with her as her dowry, and a homestead in Play. Of Erling, the son of Earl Erlend, some men say that he had fallen in Anglesey Sound, but Snorri Sturla's son says he has fallen in Ulster with King Magnus. Cole Calais' son became King Magnus' leagueman, and fared east into Norway with the king, and home to Ager with his wife, and settled down on his farms. They, Cole and Gunhilda, had 2 children. Their son's name was Calais, but their daughter's name was Ingirid. They were both of the greatest promise, and reared up with much love. 46. When King Magnus had ruled the land 9 winters, he fared away out of the land west across the sea, and harried in Ireland, and was the winter in Connaught. But the summer after he fell in Ulster on Bartholomew's Day. But when King Sigurd in the Orkneys heard of his father's fall, he fared at once to Norway, and was there taken to be king with his brothers Eystein and Olaf. Sigurd left behind him over the western sea the daughter of the Irish king. 1 winter or 2 after the fall of King Magnus, Hakon Paul's son came from the west across the sea, and the kings gave him the title of Earl in such power, as was due to his birth. Then he fared west across the sea, and took the realm under him in the Orkneys. He had always followed King Magnus while he lived. He was with him in his warfare east in Gothland, as is said in that lay which was made on Hakon Paul's son. 47. When Earl Hakon had taken the rule in the Orkneys, Magnus Earl Erlend's son came down from Scotland and asked to take his father's heritage. That pleased the freemen well, for he had very many friends. He had there many kinsmen and connections who were glad to raise him to power. A worthy man named Sigurd then had his mother to wife. Their son was Hakon Churl. They kept house and play. When Earl Hakon heard that Earl Magnus was come into the Isles, he drew force to himself, and would not give up the Orkneys or share that realm which he had there. After that friends came between them and tried to settle matters. So it came about that they were made friends on those terms, that Hakon gave up half the realm, if that were the award of the kings of Norway, and with that this strife was stayed. Magnus fared straightway in the spring to Norway to find King Eystein. He had then fared abroad.
King Eystein made him a hearty welcome, and gave him up his father's inheritance, half the Orkneys and the title of Earl.
Earl Magnus fared west over the sea to take up his power, and his kinsmen and friends, and all the people were glad at that.
Then the kinship of Hakon and Magnus throve well when friends took part in it.
There was then peace and plenty in the Orkneys so long as their friendship lasted. 48. Saint Magnus the Earl was the most peerless of men, tall of growth, manly, and lively of look, virtuous in his ways, fortunate in fight, a sage in wit, ready-tongued and lordly-minded, lavish of money and high-spirited, quick of counsel and more beloved of his friends than any man, blithe and of kind speech to wise and good men, but hard and unsparing against robbers and sea-rovers. He let many men be slain who harried the freemen and landfolk. He made murderers and thieves be taken, and visited as well on the powerful as on the weak robberies and thieveries and all ill deeds. He was no favourer of his friends in his judgments, for he valued more godly justice than the distinctions of rank. He was open-handed to chiefs and powerful men, but still he showed most care for poor men. In all things he kept straitly God's commandments, and kept down his body in many things which in his praiseworthy life were bright before God, but hidden before men. He then showed his purpose when he asked the hand of a maiden of the most noble race of Scotland, and drank the bridal feast with her. He lived 10 years with her so that he fulfilled neither of their lusts, but was pure and spotless of all carnal sins. And when he felt temptation coming over him, then he went into cold water, and asked support of God for himself. Many were those other things and noble virtues which he showed to God himself, but hid from men. 49. Those kinsmen Magnus and Hakon held the wardship of the land for some while, so that they were well agreed. So it is said in that song which is made of them, that they fought against that chief whose name was Defnjal, and who was one step further off than the earl's brother's son. And he fell before them. Thorbjorn was the name of a noble man whom they put to death in Burfirth in Shetland. It is the story of many men that they took the house over his head and burnt him inside it. There are more tidings on which songs have been made which show that they must have been both together, though here it is not fully told about them. But when those kinsmen had ruled the land some time, then again happened, what often and always can happen, that many ill-willing men set about spoiling their kingship. Then unlucky men gathered more about Hakon, for that he was very envious of the friendships and lordliness of his kinsman Magnus. 50. 2 men are they who are named, who were with Earl Hakon, and who were the worst of all the tale-bearers between those kinsmen, Sigurd and Svitsak. This slander came so far with the gossip of wicked men, that those kinsmen again gathered forces together, and each earl fared against the other with a great company. Then both of them held on to Hrossi, where the place of meeting of those Orkneyingers was. But when they came there, then each drew up his men in array, and they made them ready to battle. There were then the earls and all the great men, and there too were many friends of both who did all they could to set them at one again. Many then came between them with manliness and goodwill. This meeting was inland, a little before Palm Sunday. But because many men of their well-wishers took a share in clearing up these difficulties between them, but would stand by neither to do harm to the other, Then they bound their agreement with oaths and hansels. And when some time had gone by after that, then Earl Hakon, with falsehood and fair words, settled with the blessed Earl Magnus to meet him on a certain day, so that their kinship and steadfast new-made peace should not be turned aside or set at naught. This meeting for a steadfast peace and thorough atonement between them was to be an Easter week that spring on Egil's Isle. This pleased Earl Magnus well, being, as he was, a thoroughly whole-hearted man, far from all doubt, guile, or greed. And each of them was to have 2 ships, and each just as many men. This both swore, to hold and keep those terms of peace which the wisest men made up their minds to declare between them. But when Easter Eve was gone by, each made him ready for this meeting. Earl Magnus summoned to him all those men whom he knew to be kindest-hearted and likeliest to do a good turn to both those kingsmen. He had 2 longships and just as many men as was said. And when he was ready he held on his course to Egil's Isle. And as they were rowing in calm over the smooth sea, there rose a billow against the ship, which the Earl steered and fell on the ship just where the Earl sate. The Earl's men wondered much at this token, that the billow fell on them in a calm where no man had ever known it to fall before, and where the water under was deep. Then the Earl said, "It is not strange that ye wonder at this, but my thought is, that this is a foreboding of my life's end. May be that may happen which was before sped about Earl Hakon. We should so make up our minds about our undertaking, that I guess my kinsman Hakon must not mean to deal fairly by us at this meeting." The Earl's men were afraid of these words. When he said he had so short hope as to his life's end, and bade him take heed for his life, and not fare farther trusting in Earl Hakon. Earl Magnus answers, "We shall fare on still, and may all God's will be done as to our voyage." 1. The end of this sentence is illegible in the Miss. 2. That is, he was their second cousin. 3. The Danish translation adds, "and the wisest men were to decide between them." 51. Now it must be told about Earl Hakon, that he summoned to him a great company, and has many warships, and all manned and trimmed as though they were to run out to battle. And when the force came together, the Earl makes it clear to the men that he meant at that meeting so to settle matters between himself and Earl Magnus, that they should not both of them be over the Orkneys. Many of his men showed themselves well pleased at this purpose, and added many fearful words, and they, Sigurd and Svitsak, were among the worst in their utterance. Then men began to row hard, and they fared furiously. Havard Gunny's son was on board the Earl's ship, a friend and counselor of the Earl's, and a fast friend to both alike. Hakon had hidden from him this bad counsel, which Havard would surely not join in. And when he knew the Earl was so steadfast in this bad counsel, then he jumped from the Earl's ship and took to swimming, and swam to an isle where no man dwelt. Earl Magnus came first to Egil's Isle with his company, and when they saw Hakon coming, they knew that treachery must be meant. Earl Magnus then betook himself up on the isle with his men, and went to the church to pray, and was there that night, but his men offered to defend him. The Earl answers, "I will not lay your life in risk for me, and if peace is not to be made between us 2 kinsmen, then be it as God wills." Then his men thought that what he had said when the billow fell on them was coming true. Now for that he felt sure as to the hours of his life beforehand, whether it was rather from his shrewdness or of godly foreshadowing, then he would not fly nor fare far from the meeting of his foes. He prayed earnestly, and let a mass be sung to him. 52. Hakon and his men jumped up in the morning and ran first to the church, and ransacked it, and did not find the Earl. He had gone another way on the isle with 2 men into a certain hiding place. And when the Saint Earl Magnus saw that they sought for him, then he calls out to them, and says where he was. He bade them look nowhere else for him. And when Hakon saw him, then they ran thither with shouts and crash of arms. Earl Magnus was then at his prayers when they came to him, and when he had ended his prayers, then he signed himself with the cross, and said to Earl Hakon, with steadfast heart, Thou didst not well, kinsman, when thou wentest back on thy oaths, and it is much to be hoped that thou dost this more from others' badness than thine own. Now will I offer thee 3 choices, that thou dost some one of these rather than break thy oaths, and let me be slain guiltless. Hakon's men asked what offer he made. That is the first, that I will go south to Rome, or out far as Jerusalem, and visit holy places, and have 2 ships with me out of the land with what we need to have, and so make atonement for both of our souls. This I will swear, never to come back to the Orkneys. To this they said nay at once. Then Earl Magnus spoke, Now seeing that my life is in your power, and that I having many things made myself an outlaw before Almighty God, then send thou me up into Scotland to some of both our friends, and let me be there kept in ward, and 2 men with me as a pastime. Take thou care then that I may never be able to get out of that wardship. To this they said nay at once. Magnus spoke, One choice is still behind, which I will offer thee, and God knows that I look more to your soul than to my life. But still it better beseems thee than to take away my life. Let me be maimed in my limbs as thou pleasest, or pluck out my eyes, and set me in a dark dungeon. Then Earl Hakon spoke, This settlement I am ready to take, nor do I ask anything farther. Then the chief sprang up and said to Earl Hakon, We will slay now either of you twain, and ye 2 shall not both from this day forth rule the lands. Then answers Earl Hakon, Slay ye him rather, for I will rather rule the realm and lands than die so suddenly. So says Old Body, a truthful freeman from the southern isles, of the parley they had. He was then with Magnus, and another man with him, when they took him captive.